In 1975, a young engineer at Kodak built the world's first digital camera. It was the size of a toaster, weighed 8 pounds, and took 23 seconds to capture a single image. His bosses looked at it, said, "That's cute," and told him to bury it. That single decision would eventually cost the company $130 billion. This is the story of how Kodak literally invented the future, then chose to destroy itself rather than embrace it. And the reason why comes down to one of the most dangerous psychological traps in business: the sunk cost fallacy. To understand what went wrong, you need to understand just how dominant Kodak was. At its peak in the 1990s, Kodak employed over 145,000 people worldwide. Their film business generated profit margins of 60 to 70%. 60 to 70%. For context, Apple's profit margin on the iPhone today is around 43%. Kodak's film business was one of the most profitable products in the history of capitalism. Their brand was so powerful that the phrase Kodak moment entered the English language. They didn't just sell cameras, they sold the idea that memories were worth preserving. And for over a century, that business model worked brilliantly. Kodak controlled roughly 90% of film sales and 85% of camera sales in the United States. They were the Google of their era, the company that seemed completely untouchable. Kodak's founder, George Eastman, had built the company on a radical insight. In 1888, he launched the first consumer camera with the slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest." Before Eastman, photography was a professional's game. It required technical knowledge, expensive equipment, and a portable darkroom. Eastman democratized it. He made it simple, affordable, and accessible, and critically, he built a business model around consumables. The camera was just the gateway. The real money was in selling film, processing, and prints. It was the original razor and blades model, decades before Gillette made it famous. By the 20th century, Kodak had perfected this machine. Sell cheap cameras, sell expensive film, collect recurring revenue forever. It was a printing press for money, and that's exactly what made it so hard to let go. Now here's where psychology enters the picture. The sunk cost fallacy is our tendency to continue investing in something because of what we've already put into it, rather than what we expect to get out of it. You've experienced this yourself. You've sat through a terrible movie because you already paid for the ticket. You finished a meal you didn't enjoy because you already ordered it. You've stayed in a relationship too long because you'd already invested years. Rationally, the money is spent. The time is gone. What you've already invested should be irrelevant to your next decision. But our brains don't work that way. We feel the pain of loss far more intensely than the pleasure of gain. Psychologists call this loss aversion, and it was first described by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in 1979. We will fight harder to avoid losing $10 than we will to gain $10. And when you've invested 130 years into building the most profitable film company on Earth, the psychological weight of that investment becomes almost impossible to overcome. Back to Kodak. Steve Sasson, the engineer who built that first digital camera, didn't just create a prototype and walk away. He spent years developing the technology. He showed it to executives repeatedly throughout the late 70s and early 80s. And every time the response was the same: why would we cannibalize our own film business? This is the sunk cost fallacy in its purest corporate form. Kodak had invested billions in film manufacturing plants, chemical processing facilities, and a global distribution network for physical film. To embrace digital would mean admitting that all of that infrastructure, all of those billions, were heading toward obsolescence. So they didn't just ignore digital photography. They actively suppressed it. Internal memos from the 1980s show executives explicitly deciding to slow-walk digital development to protect film revenues. In 1981, Kodak's own internal research predicted that digital photography would replace film within 20 years. They had the warning. They had the technology. They had 2 decades to prepare. And they chose to protect what they'd already built instead of building what was coming. By the time Kodak finally released a consumer digital camera in 2001, they were a decade behind Sony, Canon, and every other competitor who hadn't been trapped by their own sunk costs. The consequences were catastrophic. In 2012, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. Their stock, which had peaked at $94 per share in 1997, fell to less than $1. Over 100,000 jobs were lost. Rochester, New York, the company town Kodak had built, was devastated. The factories were demolished. The labs were shuttered. A company that had been one of the 5 most valuable brands in the world simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. And the painful irony? Digital photography didn't destroy the photography business. It exploded it. More photographs are taken every 2 minutes today than were taken in the entire 19th century. The market Kodak feared was actually bigger than the one they were protecting. They didn't lose because the world stopped wanting to capture memories. They lost because they couldn't let go of the way they'd always done it. So what's the lesson here? The sunk cost fallacy doesn't just affect individuals who sit through bad movies. It destroys empires. And it's particularly dangerous for successful companies because success creates the biggest sunk costs. The more you've invested in a particular way of doing things, the harder it is to walk away, even when the evidence is screaming at you to change. The antidote is what psychologists call prospective thinking, making decisions based on future expected value, not past investment. Ask yourself, if I were starting from scratch today with no history, no existing infrastructure, no emotional attachment, would I make this same choice? If the answer is no, then your sunk costs are controlling your decisions. Kodak's executives were not stupid. They were some of the brightest minds in corporate America. But brilliance doesn't protect you from cognitive bias. Nothing does unless you're actively looking for it. The next time you find yourself defending a decision because of how much you've already invested, remember Kodak. They invented the future, and then they chose the past. If this changed how you think about decision-making, subscribe to Why They Won. Every week, we break down the psychology behind business success and failure so you can recognize these patterns before they cost you. Next week, we're looking at how Blockbuster's status quo bias made them laugh Netflix out of the room. You won't want to miss it.